So we've defined our user tests, and we are about to actually do the user tests for our medical device usability engineering compliance. And to kind of like recap a bit, like 80% of the compliance work for usability engineering for the IEC 62366 is actually doing something called the Summative Usability Evaluation, which actually just boils down to doing at least one user test with your medical device on the medical device, which is as close to the final thing you're going to ship as possible. So best case, it's really like the final release candidate release. Now, I usually do this for software, but for hardware, this is kind of like the same. So this kind of like puts you in a bit of a tough spot because, well, it's kind of like it's a very crappy situation. If, for example, in one of these tests, you find out like, hey, my users actually can't use the medical device, we need to like redo a lot of stuff. And it's not great timing to find that out just when you actually think you are done and maybe you have all sorts of shipping schedules already or promised your investors to actually ship the device kind of like next week or hand it in to your auditors. But that's the way it is, and that's why medical device development sometimes is kind of very painful. Now, so in the past, we had this test depression app, which was our app we just came up with, where we have a smartphone app which treats people with depression. So it has like depression causes integrated into the app and other cool stuff. And we defined some user needs for this app. So we have 3 user needs where like the patient can get treatment for depression, for example, or contact customer support. Now, the 62366, it requires us to actually do something called a summative usability evaluation where, long story short, you essentially test the user needs which are related to hazards. But it's generally good practice to just test all or most user needs just so you have kind of like a complete picture of how people actually can interact with your product. So it can be software or hardware product. And we can also keep this very simple because the user needs here, we can keep the list super short, like maybe 5 to 10 user needs for a typical product from a startup. So we likewise also only need, let's say, 5 to 10 user tests. So that's pretty cool. In our example here, we have 3 user needs and we've defined 2 user tests so far. So I'll keep things a bit short, otherwise you'll fall asleep while I do all this documentation. Now, the question for today's video is kind of like, okay, now we actually have the users in our virtual startup office and we want to actually do the user test. Now, just to recap again, for regulatory compliance reasons in the EU, you need at least 5 users, usually a bit more. In the US for FDA compliance, it's 10 or 15. You might have to look that up again. It's definitely more than 5. Now, you invite these people to your office. Again, your product is mostly the final product. Your users, these test users, are people who are as close as possible to your actual test users. And as a side note, again, people with depression, you might maybe not get those, but still people with the same like demographics, like age and so on, and people who are using a smartphone, which is most people nowadays. But if you kind of like target, if your software is even more targeted, for example, towards radiologists, you might actually have to invite radiologists, which kind of like might get expensive or very clunky. Anyway, you have these people in your startup office. Let's say there are 5 people now sitting there, and now you would typically do the user test one by one. So you don't do it in a batch. You don't kind of like test all 5 people at the same time because it's kind of like very hard to keep track of things then. So you do it one by one. And again, it doesn't even have to be at the same day. You could invite these 5 people into your office at separate times. You could even do it remotely. So you can, in the past during COVID, we also did this remotely with Google Meet where we recorded the sessions, and you don't even need to record the sessions. Like you just need to document it, and we're doing the documentation right now. Okay, so now we have the user test with 1 person. And again, we defined these 2 user tests, and now we actually want to execute these 2 user tests with one of our test humans. So we navigate in Formwork, we navigate to the bottom left section, user test runs, and then we say, hey, I want to create a new user test run. And here you can kind of like see some friendly hints for how I could fill this out. User test with Mr. Wozniak in case you're working at Apple, but I guess we are not. So let's actually call this like user test with, I don't know, patient A, or maybe like test user A. You could use the name or real name or not the real name. Anyway, you just need to be able to identify the person. And then here you could kind of like write a super quick profile of the user, like what sort of qualifications. Maybe the person is genuinely suffering from depression. So that would be a great match for this case because you have an app which treats depression. And I think auditors and you might be very happy about actually having a test user who comes very close to this profile. And maybe the person is like, let's say 25 years old, very able to use a smartphone. Like it's a typical, it's not like your grandparents or so, right? So a person is very technically able. Okay, and now which test do we want to kind of like do with this person? So we define these two tests, and actually we want to do both. So I'll select both here and click save. And this is okay. Just let's just pause here and let's kind of like state how cool this is, because like in Google Sheets this would be hell. Again, you would have to like copy paste a sheet, and now let's imagine we change something in the test and then we have to copy paste it again. So it's just like hell. And Formwork really has your back here, in my opinion. I'm biased, obviously, because I developed this product initially, and now more capable developers have taken over. Okay, so you can see. We have this user test run. We have two planned tests. We have this super nice graphical overview of this test. And actually, Formwork has copy-pasted all the information of the user test into this. I think you could call it a usability test protocol, because that's how our Google Sheets template was called in the past. And I can see, okay, cool. Now I could have my laptop with Formwork open, and I'm in the user test with test user A, whatever his name is, and then I could go through these user tests. And that's what we do right now. So assuming we have the user sitting in front of us, and then now I can go through this test, and I can kind of like say, okay, we go through the instructions, like, okay, you have the smartphone with a pre-installed app. I just ensure all of that is the case. I ensure the app is launched, user is logged in, so I could prepare this before the test, right? And now I tell the person to like open the app, and I also start editing this. And you can see, I just need to fill out the results. So I can't change the steps anymore, which makes sense. I can't change the test on the fly while I'm testing a person with this, but I should describe the results, which makes sense. Okay, so, and then I tell the person, open the app, and then the person, like, I observe what the person does. And then the person opens the app, and then like, okay, I could say like app opened successfully. So this was success. And then start depression cause, and then the idea is the user selects the right depression cause, and starts it. And then like I could say like correct cause selected and started. And then I could say and at the top here I need to like decide whether this test was successful. So I have success, partial success, failure, and skipped. And let's just say it was successful. So I save this, and then you can see, cool, we have this cool representation. Now we had one success, and that's green. So we are halfway through our tests, and one of the tests was already successful. Okay, let's assume this test was successful, and then we move on to the next test. Typically, we do this like in the same session, because, well, we are moving ahead pretty fast, and typically like a testing session might only be maybe like 10 to 15 minutes or so, to keep things reasonable, because you have to do it at least 5 times with 5 different users. Okay, so now we have a test called Contact Customer Support. Again, in the earlier videos, I skipped the instructions, and I kind of like simplified this greatly too. So let's also do that, because you kind of like know how it works. But then again, I would tell the user, I would give them the steps and say like, hey, open the app. Then like user opens app successfully, click on customer support, then the user manages to do that and messages customer support too, and let's just assume the user manages to do that too. So we can mark this test as a success too and save it, and then we can see we have 2 successful tests, and this user test run was successful. So we even see in this overview, we even see that this user test run was successful. So that's really cool. We did our first successful user test. And now again, we would need to repeat this with at least 4 other people. So just showing you how the setup would generally work. Formwork, again, Formwork saves you this gigantic amount of time. It automatically assigns these numbers. And of course, this is number 2. Now we have user test with test user B. And then here, again, we describe the characteristics of this second user. And again, in this case, we would also do all of the user tests with this person too. And then everything starts from the beginning, right? So now in the user test runs, you can kind of like see we have this other test run planned with test user B. We haven't really started it, and the procedure would be the same. So in our like startup office, now at the same time, or maybe at a different time, maybe a few hours or days later, you have the next user who comes in and you run through the tests with this user too. And that's how summative evaluation works. Now, what is different from what we looked at today in a real summative evaluation? In my opinion, not a lot. Like again, as mentioned, you would have 5 users here in total. You might have a few more user needs than I have here. You might have a few more than 3, but not that many more. You might have a few more user tests. But again, also not that many more, maybe 5 to 10. Again, keep things reasonable and keep things within a time frame where you can reasonably do a user test with a user in 10 to 20 minutes, maybe. Like, don't do it for like an hour, because you'll never be done, and your users will just also hate you for it, because it'll be extremely lengthy and boring. And then you do that, and then you are essentially done. Now, what could happen in reality is you actually see some users don't manage to get stuff done, and there you have, I guess, like the age-old conflict of a manufacturer now having, I guess, like you have different competing interests, right? Like the management might say like, no, we have to release this software, and the regulatory people might say like, yeah, but the user tests are failing, and that's not super cool. So I guess the transparent and truthful approach here would need to document that in a certain way, where you say, for example, some user tests here have actually failed. Let's just say like, okay, this one was a failure. Then you would see like, okay, this turns red. And now you kind of like have to have this discussion, right? Like now you could kind of like say, okay, we need to like make changes to the software. And then like you need to like change the software. In Formwork, it's also pretty easy, like add some software requirements, add some software tests, for example, and make a new release here. That's pretty easy. And then redo your user tests to kind of like show that this actually was effective. Or alternatively, you could kind of like argue and say like, hey, okay, this user test failed, but it was only 1 out of 5 users, and it was something which wasn't super critical or not a hazard-related use scenario, and that's why we're still fine to ship this. And this is kind of like a discussion, and it's a very complicated discussion, which you might also have to have with your auditor, depending on whether you discuss this with your auditor or not. But it's not super clear-cut. Best case, your user tests just pass. Especially as a startup with a product which is initially at least very simple, you can get a pretty good feeling for whether your user tests will pass or not, or how you build your product in a way where the user tests will actually pass. Now, this was literally 80% of the usability engineering work. So again, it's not super hard. In the past, I had way more videos on this, and that was because we didn't have a good software like Formwork to create this documentation and save us so much time. So in the past, we had to do a lot of copy pasting in Google Sheets, and that generally just sucked a lot. Now, in the next few videos, we'll be looking at the remaining 20% what we're missing. There's like one cool thing you can do, which is a formative usability evaluation, which saves you some time and which makes it a bit less likely that you will have failing user tests like we just had. So that's pretty cool. Stay tuned for that, and then see you in the next video where we dive deeper into the other 20% stuff.